Right. Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event at Indian Diaspora, Washington, D.C. Metro. Today's event is on Progressive Writers Movement in Urdu. The speaker is Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil, a well-known literary historian, writer, and critic. Introductory remarks will be given by two brothers. Concluding remarks and introductory remarks. Professor Ali Hussain will give the introductory remarks, and Professor Raza Mir will give the concluding remark. Both have been on the business side, but they have written a wonderful book on co-authoring the same book on Progressive Writers Movement, and that makes them the right person to be involved in this event. So welcome here, and Professor Ali Mirza, please take the forum and please start it.
Thank you, Razi Saab. I am really looking forward to what promises to be a fascinating talk by Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil, the author of this extremely impressive book on the progressive writers movement in Urdu. When we talk about this movement, we are referring to a formative force in Urdu literature, which became so hegemonic in the mid-20th century that it created a broad cultural consensus among the plurality of Urdu writers for generations, and still exercises an enormous influence on contemporary Urdu literature. What were the progressives' aims? In their own words, they wanted to rescue literature from the priestly, academic, and decadent classes, and to bring art into close touch with ordinary people. In the first ghazal of his diwan, Ghalib famously declares, आगही दामे शनीदन जिस कदर चाहे बिछाए मुद्दा अनखा है अपने आलमे तखरीर का. The meaning of my verses, he asserts, will forever be elusive. On the other hand, the progressives announce, फन जो नादार तक नहीं पहुंचा अपने मेयार तक नहीं पहुंचा. Art that does not speak to the poor does not achieve its potential. Ghalib's muses are from the realms of the mystical and the metaphysical. So आते हैं गैब से ये मज़ामी ख्याल में गालिब सरीर खामा नवाए सरोश है. The source of the progressive's inspiration is the real world. As Sahir writes, दुनिया ने तजुर्बात हवादिस की शक्ल में जो कुछ मुझे दिया है वो लौटा रहा हूँ मैं. The progressives addressed problems faced by ordinary people. इन दमकते हुए शहरों की फरावां मखलूक क्यों फखत मरने की हसरत में जिया करती है. ये हंसी खेत फटा पड़ता है जौबन जिनका किस लिए इनमें फखत भूख उगा करती है. For the progressives, art wasn't some moribund tradition that looked towards the glories of the past or extolled the virtues of kings or spoke longingly about the beauty of the coquettish beloved. They looked elsewhere for inspiration. और भी दुख हैं ज़माने में मोहब्बत के सिवा राहतें और भी हैं वस्ल की राहत के सिवा. So the explicit objective of the progressives, one can say, was to use their art not to interpret the world, but to change it. For them, art wasn't a mirror to be used to reflect society, but a hammer with which to shape it. So poems were anthems that exhorted people to action. चश्मे नम जाने शोरीदा काफी नहीं तोहमते इश्क़ पोशीदा काफी नहीं आज बाजार में पाबजौला चलो. They sought to expose the inequities of the world, to challenge the structures of power, and to call out oppression. जुल्म बस जुल्म है बढ़ता है तो मिट जाता है खून फिर खून है टपकेगा तो जम जाएगा. They were fiercely against war. जंग तो खुद ही एक मसला है. जंग क्या मसलों का हल देगी. आग और खून आज बख्शेगी भूख और एहतियाज कल देगी. They were unabashedly modernist and wrote odes to space travel, to factories, to trains. They were internationalists and wrote about liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere, in Vietnam, in the Congo, in Palestine, They wrote about the struggles of African Americans for racial justice in the United States and expressed solidarity with people of color across the world. कृष्ण का गीत है गोकुल की हसी शाम है तू कलेजे से लगा लें कि सिया फाम है तू. They were proto-feminists and imagined a society where women had independent power, subjecthood, and agency. They engaged in the space of popular culture by becoming writers and lyricists in cinema and using the medium to offer a social critique. So, ye mehlon, ye takhton, ye tajon ki duniya, ye insan ke dushman samajon ki duniya, ye daulat ke bhuke riwajon ki duniya, ye duniya agar mil bhi jaye to kya hai? To call for an end to religious divides. तू हिंदू बनेगा न मुसलमान बनेगा इंसान की औलाद है इंसान बनेगा. And to point out the injustices of the system. So चीनो अरब हमारा हिंदुस्तान हमारा रहने को घर नहीं है सारा जहां हमारा. The 30th anniversary of the Progressive Writers Association was held in New Delhi in 1966, and the General Secretary of the PWA, Rakhshanda Jalil, in a poignant moment summed up his feelings. Let me read that little passage and close with it. Rakhshanda Jalil writes, "Ours was no air-conditioned movement. Our stories were written in dingy rooms and dirty huts. Our poems were born in processions and workers' meetings. Our songs in police lockups. When I took over his office, I asked the then General Secretary, Ram Bilas Sharma, for the funds of the association. He gave me a pencil. We had no funds, no files, no office, no dictaphone, and yet with nothing on hand but a pencil, we wrote the most glorious chapter in the cultural renaissance of our people." So the progressive writers movement had a complex and checkered history, but no matter what else may be said about it, it offered us a vision, provisional, fluctuating, tentative, yet powerful, of a utopia centered around the notions of egalitarianism and social justice. And that legacy endures. And as we have seen, especially recently, their poems still grace spaces of resistance across South Asia. With that, let me step aside and hand the session over to Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil.
शुक्रिया. ख़वातीन हज़रात आदाब, रज़ीउद्दीन साहब आपका और इंडियन डायस्पोरा वाशिंगटन डीसी के सभी लोगों का, सभी मेंबर्स का मैं तहे दिल से शुक्रिया अदा करना चाहती हूँ. आपने मुझे और मेरे काम को इस काबिल समझा, मुझे ये मौका दिया. अली हुसैन मीर साहब और उनके बिरादर रज़ा मीर साहब के काम से मैं एक लंबे अरसे से वाकिफ़ हूँ. उनकी किताब को बार बार पढ़ा है और वो प्रीकर्सर हैं हमें से बहुत से उन लोगों का जिन्होंने अब काम करना शुरू किया है इस मूवमेंट पे. आपकी किताब एंथम्स ऑफ रेजिस्टेंस ने मुझे बार बार एक नई खिड़की मेरी समझ की खोली है. और प्रोफेसर अली हुसैन मीर साहब, आपके इस इंट्रोडक्टरी रिमार्क्स के लिए बेनतहा शुक्रिया. आपने एक बहुत न सिर्फ लूमिनस अकाउंट दिया है इस मूवमेंट का, बल्कि मेरे बोलने के लिए बहुत कम चीज़ें छोड़ी हैं. मैं कोशिश ये करूँगी कि जिन जिन चीज़ों की तरफ आपने इशारा किया, मैं कुछ हद तक उन पे और रोशनी डाल सकूं जहाँ तक मुमकिन है मेरे लिए. मेरा काम ज़्यादातर अंग्रेज़ी में होता है. मैं उर्दू के सोर्सेज को एक्सेस ज़रूर करती हूँ, लेकिन जो भी लिखती हूँ क्रिटिकल डिस्कोर्स के लिए वो अंग्रेज़ी में होता है. इसके लिए पहले से माज़रत चाहती हूँ. मेरी कोशिश ये रहेगी कि मैं एक ओवरआर्चिंग एक व्यू दूँ इस मूवमेंट का. बहुत सी चीज़ें जिन पे अभी हमने जिनका जिक्र सुना, उनमें से कुछ उन चीज़ों पे बात उठाई जाएगी. लॉसेस और गेन्स का जिक्र किया जाएगा, सक्सेसेस और फेलियर्स की तरफ भी इशारा किया जाएगा, और आखिर में कुछ ये भी देखने की कोशिश की जाएगी कि आइडियाज़ की, मूवमेंट्स की क्या कोई शेल्फ लाइफ होती है. आपकी इजाज़त से शुरू करना चाहूँगी. The significance of the progressive writers movement, PWM, which as I will be alluding to it, is uncontested for most commentators on the literary history of India. It succeeded in bringing to its fold established and emerging writers from almost all the important languages in the Indian subcontinent. Almost from its inception, it succeeded in gaining the attention and the blessings of the literary stalwarts of the time. Rabindranath Tagore, Muhammad Iqbal, Maulvi Abdul Haq, Hasrat Mohani, Acharya Narendra Dev, Tara Chand, Sarojini Naidu, while belonging to diverse literary traditions, endorsed the PWM. When I say PWM, I'm referring to the Progressive Writers Movement and its objectives. The eminent Hindi writer Prem Chand, A Line in Winter by the time the first All India Progressive Writers meeting takes place in Lucknow on the 9th of April, 1936. Prem Chand has this formidable reputation behind him. He is invited by the Young Turks of the Progressives, and not only does he come, but he writes, he comes prepared with a written address, the inaugural address, which is titled Sahitya Ka Uddeshya, the aim of literature. This is to be found in various collections. While I'll talk of the manifesto and other things later, but put simply, actually this address by Prem Chand is a finer, truer manifesto in many ways of what the aims and objectives of progressive literature, and by extension an association of progressive writers, should be. Remember also that the actual manifesto of the Progressive Writers Association has already been drafted in November 1934. And there's a very interesting story behind how it came to be written by Sajjad Zahir and a group of young people in a restaurant called Nanking Hotel in London, how they sent copies of it ahead of their Sajjad Zahir's arrival and return back to India, how it had already gained currency in many, many literary forums, how many Indian writers were already familiar with the manifesto, its contents. They were willing to extend their support, solidarity in whatever way they could. There was a burgeoning interest in Hyderabad, in Aligarh, in Lucknow, in Azimabad, in Lahore, and so on, in this new grouping that was being talked about. And as early as October 1935, Prem Chand had received this and had it translated, and also had it published in Hans, the very prestigious literary journal that he published. Also, by February 1936, it had also been published with minor modifications in the Left Review in London. So when Prem Chand is outlining Sahitya Ka Uddeshya in 9th April 1936 in Lucknow, there is already a kind of, shall we say, a groundwork has been prepared. And the address is very interesting. It says many things, but chiefly what it says is that the standard of literature has to be changed. The standard of beauty has to be changed. Hame khoobsurti ka mayar badalna hoga. Prem Chand is saying, hame ab wo अब फसानों की दुनिया से निकल के असली दुनिया में आना है, और खेत में जो औरत काम कर रही है जिसके माथे पे पसीना है, वो भी, उस पे भी कहानी लिखी जा सकती है, वो भी खूबसूरती का बायस है, उस पे भी लिखने की जरूरत है. तो इस किस्म की जो बातें साहित्य के उद्देश्य में की जा रही हैं, ये एक तरह से वो बातें हैं जो बहुत से सुनने वालों को समझ में आती हैं, और समझ में आता है कि हाँ, इस किस्म की सोशली इंगेज लिटरेचर की इस वक्त जरूरत है. Some of the greatest Urdu writers who were associated with the Progressive Writers Association, the PWA, were Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Sajjad Zahir, Ismat Chaqtai, Krishan Chandar, Kaifi Azmi, Ali Sardar Jafri, and others. The importance of this movement lies not merely in the intrinsic literary merits associated with the works of any individual writers. Instead, I think the role played by the PWA, and from 1943 onwards, its partner organization, the Indian People's Theatre Association, the IPTA as it was called, in shaping the political consciousness of large numbers of people, in its unequivocal emphasis on the need for social change, and in the relentless portrayal of these twin forces in their literature, and by extension in all forms of art and popular culture. I'll talk briefly about cinema also towards the end. So the PWM and its proponents were a powerful and inescapable force, commandeering a space for themselves on the political, social, and literary canvas of India for nearly 3 decades. In the years before independence, they influenced the debates on imperialism and decolonization, And in the years immediately after 47, they were at the center of the discourses on the nature of the newly independent post-colonial state and society. The PWM penetrated into different Indian languages, most notably Urdu, Hindi, Bangla, Marathi, Telugu, and others. My interest here is in Urdu. It is the language I've known and tried to study in different ways over the past years, but also my interest is in the Urdu Tarakki Pasand Tehreek, because I think Urdu was the lingua franca of that period that I'm looking at, the 1930s to the 1950s. Urdu was a tensile, growing, alive lingua franca of the people of Upper India. It was open to change and ideally suited to the expression of new, even radical ideas. The burst of political consciousness released from the events of 1857, the Ghadar or the mutiny, or what later historians have called the First War of Independence, the changes in different distant parts of the world at the turn of the century, the First World War, 1914 to 18, the Russian Revolution, and the consequent popularity of socialist thought, rising nationalism, growing anti-imperialist sentiments, all this and more found expression in the Urdu language before the arrival of the progressives. Urdu literature therefore reflected not one or two or three moods and trends, but a mind-boggling variety of styles, trends, and voices. Revision, reform, even radicalism was to be found in Urdu prose and poetry in the years leading up to the 1930s. Far from being moribund or anemic in body and mind, as asserted in the Progressives Manifesto, I would go so far as to say Urdu writers of the 1930s were perfectly amenable to the idea of harnessing literature to social change and the coming together of large numbers of writers in the form of a PWA is, to my mind, a classic instance of seeds being planted in the right soil at the right time. There was no dearth of intellectuals who, regardless of their sympathy or the lack of it for organized communism, saw the merit of socially purposive literature and were prepared to find common cause with all the big isms of their time. It could be anti-colonialism, anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, feminism, and by extension, other things such as land reform, redistribution of wealth, and so on and so forth. So what made the progressives different? Perhaps we should ask a question that predates the arrival of the progressives on the literary scene. Who or what is a progressive? Generally speaking, a worldview that derides nostalgia is a progressive worldview, and an individual who chooses not to look back or hearken to old glories, but to resolutely look ahead is a progressive. For instance, Ghalib was a progressive. He chose to deride Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's laudatory history of the Mughals, the Ain-e-Akbari, and he found it self-indulgent. And he, in fact, admonished Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to look ahead and not to look back at Mughal history. So definitions of progressive change and merge seamlessly generation after generation. The forward-looking world of Aligarh was considered progressive during its time, and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and others who comprised the Aligarh school of thought invited vitriol and invective in much the same way as a generation after him, Dr. Rashid Jahan Garewali and her fellow writers would, nearly 30 odd years later, for almost half a century later, let's say. Following in the footsteps of Syed Ahmad Khan, Altaf Hussain Hali, Nazir Ahmad, Maulvi Zakaullah were forward-looking, open to change, progress. In this, they were each in their own way progressive, and each was laying the groundwork for the progressives. We associate this term for those who are associated with the movement, but the point I'm trying to make is there are shades and ways in which we can describe and define progressivism. At this point, I want to briefly talk about Angare, a collection of 10 pieces, 9 stories and 1 play, published in December 1932, banned by the colonial government 3 months later. It is the first of its kind anthology in Urdu because normally you have between one cover, one contributors or one writer's writings. Here we have 4 people coming together to put together an anthology. So there is Sajjad Zahir, Ahmed Ali, Mahmood Zafar, and Dr. Rashid Jahan, 1 woman and 3 men. And with the publication and subsequent furor over it, leading to the banning 3 months later, in March 33, the definition of forward-looking underwent a sea change, and the epithets of irreligious, godless, sacrilegious, even blasphemous came to be used for a radical new sort of writing. A few years later, the adoption of a manifesto and the espousal of an ironclad ideology made the latter-day progressives a force to reckon with, though they were by no means the first to raise their voice against imperialism and oppression. Nor were they the first to call for unequivocal freedom and a new beginning. What set them apart from others and what made their voice distinct in that babel of voices that cried for revolution and change? Was their use of the word progressive, or to be more precise, taraqi pasand, literally meaning liking progress? Was it this that set them apart? Different progressives have interpreted the meaning of the word progressive in different ways. Isma Chughtai, for instance, who remained associated with the movement, but always at her own terms all her life. I mean, she never cut herself away, though occasionally there was a distancing and so on. That's a story in itself, but she remained a part of the movement, but she set the terms, her own terms for it, for her engagement with them. She has said somewhere something very interesting. She wrote an essay called Taraqi Pasand Adab Aur Main. And here she says, it wasn't even as if progressivism was born in the year 1935 and died at the dispersal of the group or people, the dispersal of a group of people. The progressive movement's foundation stone was laid when the first man in the history of mankind groaned under the under oppression experienced through injustice, the usurpation of his rights, exploitation, inequality, and tyranny. यानी आदम काल से जब पहली दफा किसी ने अपनी आवाज उठाई किसी भी फॉर्म ऑफ इनजस्टिस से, तो उनका मानना था कि प्रोग्रेसिविज्म तब से शुरू होता है. As long as there is the possibility of progress on this planet, progressivism will remain. Till such time as the big fish swallows the smaller one, progressivism will indeed remain alive. In another interview to the Mehfil journal, she has gone so far as to, Ismat has, to say that Kabir was the Bhakta poet, Kabir was progressive. So this is a generous, sort of fluid definition of progressivism, and perhaps such a definition also explains why so many people were initially enamored by progressivism and came, and because they saw, like Ismat, they saw progressive literature as being concerned with humanity, with social awareness, with humanism. And so there was nothing in it really. And when to this you add the very potent brew of nationalism, then clearly there is nothing in the progressives' agenda, as it were, that people could find fault with. And that explains the very large numbers of people who were drawn to it. While examining the PWN and the works of the most famous contributors and their role in nation building, shaping popular consciousness and defining culture, it is important to understand the reasons why and how such a movement came into existence in the first place. I would like to believe that the PWM did not spring fully formed out of thin air in the mid-1930s, with the drawing up of a manifesto, the holding of a first All India Progressive Writers Association meeting, or the declaration of a body of writers. I would like to believe that the PWA was not a foreign plant grafted, foreign exotic plant grafted onto native soil, where it went on to produce these very dramatic looking flowers. No, I don't think it was that. It was instead, to my mind, a literary, political, social movement in consonance with the Indian realities of the times. I want to quote here briefly Ralph Russell, who has said, by the 1920s, themes of revolt against imperialism, of nationalism, and of radical social reform were already common in literature. For example, both in the poetry of Iqbal and the prose of Premchand. And the PWA represented simply the continuation and development of such themes. Quote closes. And so while the influences were diverse, the PWM was essentially, to my mind, an Indian phenomena. Yes, it drew from elsewhere. It drew, of course, from the Russian Revolution. It drew from various other, the short story as a genre. I mean, let's not just talk of content. Let's also talk of form. The short story as a genre blossomed dramatically, and it is because of the translations that were happening, because of the cross-fertilization that was happening. It was because of the various things that these very cosmopolitan, occasionally bilingual set of writers were introducing into Urdu. So the PWA itself, the association, the Anjuman Taraqi Pasand Musannafin, was a heterogeneous group of writers. Some established, others upcoming, some already committed communists. Mahmoud Zafar and Rashid Jahan and Sajjad Zahir were already members of the party fairly early on. In fact, at the time of Angari itself, others who had socialist leanings, and a great many with no discernible ideological moorings, save an inchoate desire to change the world. It is this last group that I like to call the fellow travelers who made up the bulk of the progressives. They drew their inspiration from the world around them and from political and social events, both within India and the world outside. अली आपने शुरू में साहिर का वो शेर पढ़ा था कि जुल्म आखिर जुल्म है, बढ़ता है तो मिट जाता है, खून फिर खून है, टपकेगा तो जम जाएगा. As late as the 60s, this is actually inspired by the execution and murder of Patrice Lumumba. So this is not an inward-looking group of people. As late as the 60s, as late as that, and of course during its high noon, we see plenty of such examples of where they are making common cause, not just with the big movements that they see around them in India. But the murder of Patrice Lumumba, it sparks outrage. The Indian progressives are writing in white heat over something that they could very well have said, oh, well, it's happening somewhere in some distant part of the world. But no, so they are drawing their inspiration, and that cosmopolitanism, I mean, Faiz is a wonderful example of that, of how he's talking of the Laila-e-Watan, the beloved who is the nation, but he's also talking about so many other things. The nature of the movement is yet another theme that I have taken up in great detail in my book. So those of you who've read it may perhaps be familiar. Suffice to say here for this occasion that the PWA was not merely a literary grouping, and one cannot stress this enough. It was always, from its very beginning, in its broadest sense, also a social and a political movement. From its earliest days, it strove to draw literature closer to social realities and the cause of nation building. This was picked up very early on from the very beginning, virtually, both by politicians and poets. Let me give you two examples. Invited to address the Allahabad session of the PWA in November 1937, Jawaharlal Nehru, showed his approval by beginning his address thus. I'm quoting, "In my opinion, a writer should not be a mere utopian, for unless he has something fundamental in his mind and his writing has connection with reality, with actual life, his work cannot prove enduring." Rabindranath Tagore, who's also invited to the same November 1937 conference and is not able to come, but he sends a luminous sort of written message. And here again, he's urging writers to mingle with the people. He says, don't make the mistake I did. Don't live in an ivory tower of your own making. Know the people. Literature that is not in harmony with mankind, Tagore is saying, is destined to failure. It is another matter that by the 40s and in later years, the CPI, the PWA is seen as a cultural front of the CPI. And there is some merit in this charge that as its association with the party, or at least the association of certain members, certain ideologues within the core group of the PWA and their association with the party increases, as someone like Comrade Dange is invited. I mean, Nehru's also a politician, but he's a writer too. He's talking about writers being in touch with society. In contrast, we have Comrade Dange being invited, and that's a long distance that the progressives have traveled, from calling Premchand to calling Comrade Dange to address the Bombay meeting. And so naturally, the tone and tenor of these meetings is changing. The complexion of what writers are being asked to do is undergoing a change. Let us briefly look at what was being written during the high noon of the progressive period. The writers associated with this movement were people who wrote not necessarily for the joy of crafting great literature. They wrote because they saw and were quick to seize the great inescapable link between literature and socio-political change. They believed literature should hold up a mirror to society. And this is something Premchand and others had said, कि साहित्य का, अदब का काम है कि वो एक आईना दिखाए समाज को, और उस आईने में आपके इर्द गिर्द जो भी है, अच्छा बुरा खराब, जो भी ऊंच नीच है, जो भी झोल है, जो भी क्रैक्स और फिशर्स हैं, वो उस आईने में नजर आने चाहिए. और साहित्य का प्राइमरी पर्पस यही है कि वो समाज को आईना दिखाए. So literature for the progressives was a valuable tool in the cause of nation building and social transformation. It would be futile, therefore, to look merely at the literary merit or the lack of it. In fact, one of the oft levied charges against progressive literature was that it was in the nature of sloganeering, often, okay, and it was a propagandist literature. Another charge that was levied against it was that it was in the nature of a knee-jerk reaction, वक्ती अदब. कई लोगों का ये कहना है कि हम जब मीटिंग्स में जाते थे तो हमसे ये उम्मीद की जाती थी कि हम अपने माथे पे ये चिट्ठियां लगा के जाएं कि हमें आज इस चीज पे लिखना है. जैसे अगर बॉम्बे में नेवल अपराइजिंग होती है तो फौरन आपको एक कहानी लिख देनी है नेवल म्यूटनी पे. जो भी कोई चीज बड़ी या छोटी which causes a blip in the political radar of a certain core group, then diktats were issued. Some agreed, but it caused unrest within those writers. Several others flatly refused, like Ismat, when she was told, start writing about the mill workers and the peasants. She says, no, I don't know anything about them. Ismat had a very clearly defined canvas and she could write in that. And the few times that she did stray, when Masuma, for example, or the Chawl stories, she's not as successful as she is in what is really her milieu. Some other writers, Rajendra Singh Vedi is a wonderful example of those who changed their path, their trajectory, as it were. He was quite the poster boy of the progressives till he was writing stories about postal clerks and the garam coat sort of stories. But when he was told कि अब आप मजदूर के बारे में लिखिए या फैक्ट्री में काम करने वालों के बारे में लिखिए, so he said, I can write about the lower middle class, but this that you're asking me to do, I cannot do. So he went into filmmaking and other things. We have instances of those. We also have instances of some who were, well, there's no nice way of saying this, some who were sidelined to the extent that, that they fell silent. Their literary careers show a pause. Their literary careers show a gap where a certain kind of romantic writing that they were doing. Jazbi Saab is the best example of this. That Jazbi Saab's romanticism could not be tolerated, and so for a period of 10, 20 years, we don't see much coming out. So some pens were silenced, others were sidelined. All of this is also part of the dark underbelly of the High Noon. Right. So I think progressive literature can never be disengaged from its context. A closed textual reading in isolation of the writer's background and beliefs, or for that matter, the time and circumstance during which any given progressive text is written, I think does not work. The text and the context we find in the case of the bulk of the progressive writing is intertwined. As the ingredients of the original manifesto, the one that was drafted in London in 1934, began to leach out, and party-based ideology and an implacable Unitarian orthodoxy began to take its place. The glue of socialism and nationalism, a potent combination used with great efficacy for the freedom and anti-colonial movement by political parties of all hues, as that glue began to come unstuck shortly after 1947, we see the steady decline and the disintegration and the coming apart. The anti-colonial agenda being fulfilled with the new government under Nehru, initiating several socialist plans such as land reforms, the zamindari abolition, the buildings of the roads, the dams, the factories, what Nehru very grandly called the temples of modern India. All of this, the PWA found itself on a receding turf. Even the 5-year plans based on the Soviet model as a remedy for mass unemployment and a cure-all for rampant financial backwardness was appropriated by the Congress. Increasingly, the PWM found the ground beneath its feet slipping away, its flock dwindling due to deserters, its creative agenda hijacked by mainstream political parties, and its creative output trashed by literary critics, many of whom were actually former progressives. We have many, many instances of people who started out their literary careers as progressives. They were the pillars of the weekly progressive meetings, but gradually there was a disenchantment, and many became very strident critics of progressive writing. And they were quick to call it mere propaganda. And the worst blow of all was the communally divisive forces that rose in the wake of independence, causing many to decry the culmination of their struggle as a mere false freedom, which is the party line that this freedom is not the freedom. Even Faiz is writing, "Ye daag daag ujala, ye shab gazida seher." So the freedom that is coming is the night-bitten dawn. It is not the real freedom that they were hoping for. So on their part, the left-wing parties too were being forced on the defensive. Rise of new and more aggressive conservatism and a growing religious awareness, especially of religious differences, made many notions associated with the progressive ideology seem suddenly outdated. The PWM's ambition of transforming the transforming the working class into an organized party seemed incomprehensible to many within the fold. Moreover, the overweening political ambitions of a certain core group, often called the Bombay Progressives. In the course of my research, I was lucky enough to meet many who were still alive and who had very clear, sharp memories. Of course, there are the memoirs and the diaries also that provide, and the autobiographies and memoirs that provide an account of those days. But my interviews with people like Mehndi Saab in Aligarh and others who had these no holds barred views on what they thought was the reason. I mean, the Rana Dive line, the sidelining of PC Joshi and how it impacted, and how PC Joshi was actually the Khara Admi who kept an eye out for even if the PWA was a cultural front, it was something that was, along with the IPTA, it was carrying out things that were in consonance with what people wanted. So all of this, we see this overweening political ambitions of this core group, the Bombay progressives, who are now issuing diktats. Professor Zahida Zaidi in Aligarh told me that she was a very young student. She was a master's student. There was a very active branch of the Aligarh PWA. And a gentleman called Lal Siddiq, who I had the occasion to meet several times. Now he was running the Aligarh branch of the Aligarh PWA, and a diktat, Zahida Zaidi says, came from Bombay to critique Jazbi Saab's poem. And she says, मेरी क्या औकात, मैं तो एक MA में पढ़ने वाली young लड़की, और मुझे जज़्बी साहब की नज़्म को बिल्कुल, I mean, I was asked to critique it and take it apart. And she says, these were things people did, but this caused enormous disquiet and unrest within many people. There was also the silencing that I alluded to earlier, the sidelining of certain voices. Remember also that the progressives also published just through people's publishing house, through various other presses and of distancing or of pushing to the margins voices that wanted to belong, were people who wanted to be part of a fellowship of writers. Then there was also the derision, the outright mockery. There were attempts to, for example, ban obscenity from literature, and the objects of this ban were Miraji, the poet, Ismat Chughtai, and Manto. And it affected these three people in different ways. This derision, this mockery, this desire to ban. Of course, the idea of banning was never implemented, and Hasrat Mohani stood up in that session where this motion was moved to ban obscenity from literature, and Hasrat Mohani said, "Pehle obscenity kya hai? Phir hum sochenge iske baare mein." So the idea was found to be very ludicrous, and fortunately it was dropped. So all of these things combined to take away from the bonhomie and good cheer of the early days. Yet the PWM did not die. It simply lost control. There can be no real date or single reason for its eclipse. It gradually shrank in importance, slipping from public memory, becoming a subject of curiosity to the serious student of social and literary history, and a mere byword for liberal humanism to the general public. However, no amount of neglect, apathy, or misinformation can undermine the importance of the PWA in the history of political thought and literary trends in India. The portrayal of its own world by some of those most closely associated with the PWA cannot be matched by any historical or literary commentator. There have been literary histories and recently again, and Khalil Rahman Azmi has written a fine history, but I think the work of the progressives themselves hold up a mirror of the world around them. The text is supposed to be the word, and in this case, works of those associated with the PWA are faithful, if occasionally cracked mirrors. They show the world, not the closed, idiosyncratic, highly individual inner world that would interest the writer of the modern and the postmodern period in the years to come, but the real world outside. The works of the progressives show the world as it was, sluggishly and fearfully throwing away the shackles of tradition and stepping into a new and changing world. The mirrors can be said to be flawed insofar as the views they held out were occasionally exaggerated or reflected in words that were not of the highest literary standards. Another important factor to remember is that the glory days of the progressive writers movement also spanned the most tumultuous period of modern Indian history. Gandhi's call to Satyagraha, India's response to the rise of fascism, Nehru's Muslim mass contact program, in Gandhi's second civil disobedience movement, the Second World War and its impact on India, the Great Bengal famine, the rise of Telangana, the Tehbaga movements, and various other peasant uprisings all across India. The wave of nationalism that culminated in independence and finally partition, and the communal disturbances that scarred the nation, all of this finds very faithful representation in the works of the progressives. And not just in India, but the Rosenberg trial and what you earlier alluded to, Ali, the decolonization of Africa, the emergence of a new world order. So you have people writing about the African countries that are bit by bit throwing away the yoke of imperialism and colonialism. There's talk of greater Afro-Asian unity. Sardar Jafri is writing Jangal Jangal Phool Khila Hai. There's talk of making common cause with the African brother, with nations in Asia. So there is all of this happening. The coming of independence saw the departure of many writers to Pakistan, especially Sajjad Zahir, who was sent to set up the Communist Party of Pakistan. The flock dwindled. Many of the progressive journals, which had been so powerful and so influential in that time, closed down. Urdu itself shrank in importance. It was no longer the lingua franca. The differences between the Hindi and the Urdu progressives, on which a lid had been kept, partly by the charismatic presence of people like Sajjad Zahir, but also because there were greater issues to be fought. There were greater wars to be fought. Those again began to come to the forefront. The question of Urdu itself began to pose many problems. In a purely literary sense, I want to very briefly allude to Jadidiyat, this rise of this new literary movement, which is taking the place, which is coming up, and where the inner world, the world of the mind, the world of the world of ideas is being given importance. And the writer is saying कि मुझे अपने दुख, अपने गम को भी इजहार करने का पूरा हक है अपनी शायरी में, अपने creative writing में. Now, having said that, while the may have weakened as a literary grouping, their influence remained not just strong, but actually grew, and that was Hindi cinema. At a time when the squabbling and the differences between the core ideological group and others was taking ugly tones, Hindi cinema is not showing those cracks and fissures. If anything, it is taking the progressive thought and ideology to the nooks and crannies of the popular imagination. एक ऐसे वक्त में जब रेडियो बहुत अहमियत रखता है, तो रेडियो और ट्रांजिस्टर, चाहे वो पान की दुकान पे हो, चाहे चाय खाने में हो, वहाँ से जो गाने बज रहे हैं और वहाँ से जो हिंदी फिल्म के गाने बज रहे हैं, और वो हो सकते हैं जैसे प्रेम धवन लिखते हैं, जो कि एक इप्टा से भी जुड़े हुए थे और फिल्म इंडस्ट्री का भी हिस्सा थे, वो कह रहे हैं बहुत सिंपल सरल लफ्जों में वो बात कह रहे हैं, जो कि असल में बहुत तकलीफ दे रही है प्रोग्रेसिव्स को अंदर ही अंदर. ही सेइंग छोड़ो कल की बातें, कल की बात पुरानी, नए दौर में लिखेंगे हम मिलकर नई कहानी. तो इस किस्म की बातें बहुत सी हो रही हैं. B.R. चोपड़ा नए दौर में, साहिर लिख रहे हैं, साथी हाथ. और ये जो, अगर आप में से जिन लोगों ने ये फिल्म को पिक्चराइज होते हुए देखा है, वो एक बहुत सोवियत टाइप की उसकी शूटिंग है. उसमें बहुत खुश लोग दांत दिखा रहे हैं, बहुत तंदुरुस्त मालूम दे रहे हैं, और वो एक से दूसरे को एक लाइन लगा के वो किसी फैक्ट्री या इंडस्ट्रियल साइट पे काम कर रहे हैं, और वो गा रहे हैं इस किस्म के गाने. साथी हाथ बढ़ाना, साथी रे एक अकेला थक जाएगा, मिलकर बोझ उठाना. तो जो गांधी की माफ कीजिएगा, जो नेहरू की कॉल है 1950s में कि हर शख्स को अपना कंधा, अब you need to put your shoulder to the wheel and get on with the business of nation building, इसको प्रोग्रेसिव फिल्म लिरिसिस्ट, चाहे वो कैफी हो, चाहे वो सरदार जाफरी, फिल्म के जरिए, स्क्रिप्ट के जरिए, ख्वाजा अहमद दबास की फिल्मों के जरिए हम इसको अलग अलग तरीके से देख रहे हैं. और नेहरू जो ख्वाजा अहमद अब्बास calls himself an unabashed admirer of Nehru, और भी बहुत फिल्म लिरिसिस्ट हैं जो नेहरू के विजन को अलग अलग तरीके से इंटरप्रेट कर रहे हैं. मसलन साहिर कहते हैं तू हिंदू बनेगा ना मुसलमान बनेगा, इंसान की औलाद है इंसान बनेगा. I come to the last part of, I just want to conclude here and take some questions. But before I end, I want to leave you with a question that I was asking many people all those years ago when I was in the process of writing my thesis. I would talk to scholars and researchers, communists, those who were not communists, those who were fellow travelers, those who were modernists, those who were part of the movement but were later disenchanted. My question to them was, do ideas die when movements die? प्लेटो कहते हैं कि आइडिया एक प्रिंसिपल रियलिटी है और प्रिंसिपल रियलिटी जो है वो खत्म नहीं होती, वो रहती है हमेशा. So in contrast to individual objects or material things which undergo change and flux, Plato believed that ideas are perfect, eternal, and immutable. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, after all, did not die once the French Revolution was over and its aims and objectives had been achieved and a new republic had been established. Movements propelled by ideas, the movements may be curtailed or they may decline, but their influence can also diminish. Some of the works that were associated with that movement can perhaps, as we know, be lost in the mists of time and be forgotten or overlooked, or you need to go looking for them to even find them today. But surely the idea of progressivism itself does not die. I want to leave you with the answer. I got many answers, but the one answer that has stayed with me, which I would like to leave with you, is the answer I got from Mushtaq Yusufi Sahab, the satirist and the prose stylist. Zehra Nigah Sahiba कराची में मुझे मुश्ताक यूसुफी से मिलाने ले गई और उनसे भी बातचीत हुई और उनके he was no progressive as we know, but बहरहाल उन्होंने बहुत मुझे कई दिलचस्प चीज़ें बताई, सवालों के जवाब दिए. फिर जब मैंने उनसे यही बात पूछी जो मैं कई लोगों से पूछती थी उस जमाने में कि डू आइडियाज डाई, तो उन्होंने अपने खास अंदाज में मुझसे कहा, बीबी आप जब फल में से जूस निकालती हैं तो जूस तो आप पी लेती हैं, जो बचता है वो खोजड़ होता है, वो ज़ाय किया जा सकता है. उनका ये कहना था कि जो क्रिएटिव राइटर होता है वो जो मुफीद चीज़ होती है उस मूवमेंट की उसको उसके अपने अंदर जज्ब कर लेता है, जो बचता है वो खोजड़ है, उसकी कोई अहमियत नहीं है. और जब कोई क्रिएटिव राइटर अपना कलम उठाता है लिखने के लिए तो जो मुफीद चीज़ उसके अंदर जज्ब हो गई है उसकी तासीर रहती है और वो तासीर जो है वो नहीं मिटती है. तो मैं अपनी बात यहीं ख़त्म करती हूँ. अगर आप लोगों के कोई सवाल हैं तो I'll be happy to take.
So let's have the concluding remarks, and after that we will have a question and answer session. It's a wonderful muqaddimah that you have put for or against or pro progressive writers movement. So let's hear Raza Sahab, please.
Sure. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Razi Sahab and the Indian Diaspora, Washington, D.C. for putting this इस महफिल का इनेकाद किया उन्होंने और हमको ये फोरम फराहम किया कि हम प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स के बारे में बात कर सकें. और मैं I'm coming after two stalwarts between Ali and Rakhshanda, and in particular Dr. Jalil's fine-grained and granular analysis of the history of the Progressive Writers Association. The ground has been really well covered. Thank you very much. और एक वजह से आपने मुझे बरी कर दिया कि मेरे जो कंक्लूडिंग रिमार्क्स हैं वो मैं बिल्कुल जो चाहे कह सकता हूँ. और and therefore I would like to take this opportunity to briefly entertain you actually because I think that जो मवाद था वो हमको मिल चुका है. The juice has already been extracted, so to speak. और लेकिन कुछ निशानदेहियां मैं just by way of emphasizing a few points मैं कहना चाहता हूँ. पहली बात ये कि the progressive movement was a popular movement. and that is very important to understand that during its time, it was like a colossus that destroyed Urdu literature in every aspect, whether it is prose, poetry, drama, and everything. मखदूम ने खूब कहा था कि हयात लेके चलो, कायनात लेके चलो, चलो तो सारे जमाने को साथ लेके चलो। और मेरा ये मानना है कि जहाँ तक ये प्रोग्रेसिव आइडियोलॉजी थी, जो प्रोग्रेसिव सेंटिमेंट था सोसाइटी में, उसको इन्होंने साथ लेके चला, और उसका कल्बिनेशन मजरू बयान करते हैं कि मैं अकेला ही चला था जानिबे मंजिल, मगर लोग साथ आते गए और कारवां बनता रहा. That is my first point. The socialist, the progressive movement, let us remember, was also socialist, and it was infected with the understanding, inflected with the understanding that there's a fundamental contradiction between labor and capital, which they needed to, go on the side of the labor. बहुत ही खूबसूरती से शायराना अंदाज में साहिर ने इसको थियोराइज किया कि नौ इंसान पे ये सरमाया और मेहनत का तजाद. They were very clear, specific about it. The other thing is that despite their commitment to modernity, just to finish the earlier thought, so their aesthetic was an aesthetic experiment. And to read aesthetic experiment as aesthetic failure is folly. They were they understood that they could write in certain specific ways. So the way they were writing was not because they were limited, but because that was their, that was their aim. मुझको इसका रंज नहीं है, साहिर कहते हैं, मुझको इसका रंज नहीं है, लोग मुझे फनकार न माने, फिक्रो सुखन के ताजर मेरे शेरों को अशआर न माने. And then also that despite their commitment to, a complete change in the outlook of literary expression, they were very, very, they had a tremendous amount of fidelity to the classical canon. तो उनके ये जो नज़में थी, वो बिल्कुल, they were very much connected to the, classical tradition. We must remember that. I'll just give you an example from Habib Jalil. The content is very strident, but the style, it could be a ghazal, कि और सब भूल गए हरफ सदाकत लिखना, रह गया काम हमारा ही बगावत लिखना, दहर के गम से हुआ रब तो हम भूल गए सर्फ खामत की जवानी को क़यामत लिखना. और इस शेर के लिए आपको तकलीफ दी है कि न सिले की न सिताइश की तमन्ना हमको, न सिले की न सिताइश की तमन्ना हमको, हक में लोगों के हमारी तो है आदत लिखना. तो जिन्होंने गालिब पढ़ा है उनसे वो immediately समझ सकते हैं कि they make this connection to Ghalib. I think that Dr. Jalil was very, did a wonderful job of telling us that the progressive tradition does not come out of nowhere. And there are a lot of people, whether it is Ghalib or Mir particularly, who really was against certain kinds of religious orthodoxy, that these progressive writers were connecting themselves to the earlier progressive and modernist traditions. And by way of anecdotal information, we must remember that many, if I may use this word, many anti-progressive theorists tend to accentuate and overemphasize and often misrepresent the relationships between progressives as, cranky and cantankerous and, combative. But the reality is that there was a lot more solidarity among the progressives, even at the personal level, than we give them credit for. Manto or Ismat Chugtai or any of these people, they were totally connected to the movement. So any attempt to sort of create this binary within the progressive movement is disingenuous. कि हमको मंटो पसंद है, लेकिन हमको किशन चंद्र पसंद नहीं है. हमको फैज और मजाज पसंद है, लेकिन अली सरदार जाफरी उतने खास नहीं. I mean, these are all, disingenuous sort of binaries that are often created. They sometimes probably push the envelope a little too much in terms of, गमे जाना को बंद करो और गमे दौरान की बात करते रहो, and so on and so forth. the progressives, and this is my last point, and I want to end by reciting something for you. The progressives were always on the right side of history. And what more can you hope for? What more can you ask a movement for? Okay, jab bhi, whenever there is a conflict in society, I dare say, मजाज ने बहुत अच्छे और खूबसूरत अशआर लिखे हैं अगेंस्ट हिजाब. कोई और शय है, ये इसमत नहीं है. लेकिन if Majaz had been here today in India, I am pretty sure that he would be writing ash'ar in favor of the young women of Karnataka and their right to veil themselves. That is my point. And so to go back to this sort of soaring optimism that the progressives tried to communicate many times in their poetry, I want to conclude by reciting just pieces of Sahir's Nazm, Mere Ahd Ke Hasino. In 1958, the Sputnik blasted into space. And, humanity was really reaching out for the stars, as it were. So, उसी ज़िम्न में साहिर ने लिखा था कि first he's extolling the stars and how they are far away and they are mysterious, and then he pivots. So वो सितारे जिनकी खातिर कई बेकरार सदियां, मेरी तीर बख्त दुनिया में सितारा वार जागे, कभी रफ़तों पे लपके, कभी वसतों से उलझे, कभी सोगवार सोए, कभी नगमाबार जागे. वो बुलंद बाम तारे, वो फलक मकाम तारे, जो नशान दे के अपना रह बेनशा हमेशा, वो हसी, वो नूर ज़ादे, वो खला के शाहज़ादे, जो हमारी किस्मतों पर रहे हुक्मरां हमेशा. So dependence on the stars is a sign of, moribund, and it goes on a lot. I'll cut to the chase and come to the pivot. And he says, मेरे अहद के हसीनो, वो नजर नवाज तारे, मेरा दौर इश्क परवर तुझे नजर दे रहा है. वो जुनू जो आबो आतिश को असीर कर चुका है, see the modernist stuff, वो जुनू जो आबो आतिश को असीर कर चुका है, वो खला की वसतों से भी खराज ले रहा है. मेरे पास रहने वालों, and here is the final slogan, मेरे पास रहने वालों, मेरे बाद आने वालों, मेरे दौर का ये तोहफा तुम्हें साजगार आए. तुझे साजगार गुजरे, कभी तुम खला से गुजरो किसी सीम तन के खातिर, कभी तुमको दिल में रखकर कोई गुलजार आए. I thank you very much for this wonderful session, and let's have the question and answers for Dr. Jalil.
Thank you very much. Before we go for question and answer, here is the coming week's event. We have invested a lot in this particular event. This is going to be a live stage performance of the last. It is a recreation of the last Mushara at Red Fort, Shamaya Sabistan Delhi. Danish Iqbal is script and direction, under his direction. We are portraying Bahadur Shah Zafar, Zawq, Ghalib, Momin, and Dagh. So please join this coming Saturday. And now this will be a moderated question and answer session. Our moderator, our host is Dr. Rafat Hussain. He is going to be taking questions as he feels fit. Okay, thank you very much, Rafat.
Thank you, Razi Bhai. Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Jalil. Thank you, Professor Ali Hussain Amir and Professor Raza Mir. And thank you so much for telling us about the progressive movement, although in this group, it's nothing new. Most of us are progressive. I wish there were more progressive people like you. And when I was listening to Raza Mir Saab, he said, they are always on the right side of the history, but they are always left-oriented. So anyway, most of you are now veteran on this group, and they know how to ask the question. And you can raise your digital hand or show your interest in the chat box. So the first one is, I think, Nazir Saab. Nazir Saab question is, let me read it to save the time. how is the progressive movement in Hindustani, or you can say Urdu, Hindi, affected by decline of Urdu, the ascent of Sanskritized Hindi, and the recent cultural, social, political turbulence in India. So what do you think? How does it affect the recent situation in India? Or
there are two schools of thought.
Urdu?
There are two schools of thought about Urdu in India today, modern Urdu in modern India today. There are the doomsdayers who say Urdu is dead and dying and gone, and whatever Urdu we have is through content-driven programming. So there are these ghazals and, you know, of Ghalib and Mir and others who people recite to each other. There is the Sahi or Galat, more often than not Galat share that people forward to each other on WhatsApps, and bas yehi ek Urdu hai. There is another school of thought, and I must say I belong to the second thought, that says no, Urdu, yes, it has declined. Yes, there are fewer people who are reading Urdu in Urdu. Yes, the numbers of literary journals has gone down, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that Urdu is dead and that there is no new literature being written in Urdu. Some years ago, I edited a collection of writings on communalism. I went looking for writings on secularism, but I also was looking out for writings on its conjoined twin, which is communalism. So, बोलने का कहने का तरीका बदल गया. एक बहुत मुख्तसर सा आपको एग्जांपल देती हूँ और उम्मीद है उससे आपको आपके सवाल का जवाब मिलेगा. एक साहब हैं जिन्होंने कहानी लिखी है, गुजरात में लोकेटेड है और राइट्स हो चुके हैं, और एक शहर है, कोई नाम नहीं दिया जाता है, एक शहर है जहाँ कर्फ्यू लगा हुआ है. लोगों को ये इजाजत दी जाती है कि आप नमाज पढ़ने अपने मोहल्ले की मस्जिद में जा सकते हैं, बस इतनी कर्फ्यू इतनी देर के लिए खोला जाएगा. लोग जाते हैं हाथ, और लेकिन आप हाथ ऊपर करके अपने अपने घरों से जाएंगे. लोग हाथ ऊपर किए किए मस्जिद में जाते हैं, लेकिन अफसोस ये कि वो सिजदा भी हाथ ऊपर करके करते हैं. अब इस किस्म की कहानी लिखी जा रही है, तो क्या ये प्रोग्रेसिव राइटिंग नहीं है? मेरे ख्याल से तो है. तो प्रोग्रेसिव राइटिंग कोई खत्म तो नहीं हो जाएगी ना, वो लिखी जाएगी, और वो स्क्रिप्ट से बंदिशें आ सकती हैं, तकलीफें महसूस हो सकती हैं, लेकिन स्क्रिप्ट मार तो नहीं सकती ना क्रिएटिव राइटिंग को. और बाय द वे ये कहानी उर्दू में ही लिखी गई थी, मैंने इसका तर्जुमा करके अंग्रेजी में इसको लिखा, लेकिन ऐसी बात नहीं है कि उर्दू में इस किस्म की कहानियां नहीं लिखी जा रही हैं, अब भी लिखी जा रही है. हाँ, वो मंटो की जैसा, जो मंटो का एक कॉलिंग अ स्पेड वाला मामला था, शायद वो कम है. शायद आज के उर्दू के लिखने वाले में, अफसाना निगार में, खासतौर से अफसाना निगार में, शायद थोड़ी सी पॉलिटिकल करेक्टनेस है जो कृष्ण चंद्र मंटो बेदी में नहीं थी. उसकी अपनी वजहात हैं, उस पर भी हम बात कर सकते हैं, लेकिन ऐसा नहीं है कि वो कहानी जिसको हम प्रोग्रेसिव राइटिंग के चौड़े बड़े एम्बिट में देखते हैं वो नहीं लिखी जा रही है, ऐसा मुझे नहीं लगता.
Thank you, Dr. Saiba. Hassan Ghayas Saab, and after that, Fazal Khan. Hassan Ghayas Saab, unmute yourself.
Yes, I have. What do you think are the reasons why this progressive movement has had a dwindling impact over time? And how do you see the prospects of his revival in the contemporary context in India?
देखिए, प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स एसोसिएशन never really died or declined. There is an existing PWA 60s, 70s, 80s, अभी 2008 में और उसके बाद तक एक साहब थे जिनका भी हाल में इंतकाल हुआ है, प्रोफेसर अली जावेद साहब, वो उसके जनरल सेक्रेटरी थे और वो बहुत एक्टिवली कुछ ना कुछ करते रहते थे. उनके साथ मैं भी कभी कभी अमृतसर और चंडीगढ़ और ऐसी जगहों पे गई हूँ जहाँ हमने देखा है कि जो स्टार वैल्यू थी अली जावेद साहब की एज अ स्पीकर, और कैसी बड़ी तादाद में लोग आते थे उनको सुनने, तो वो सब है. लेकिन जो लिंकेजेस हाई नून के ज़माने में हमें PWA की दिखती थी किसान सभा के साथ, या जो भिवंडी में बड़े बड़े मुशायरे होते थे जहाँ इंडस्ट्रियल वर्कर्स के हब में जाके, उनके गढ़ में जाके मुशायरे किए जा रहे थे, जो उनकी ज़बान में उनके कंसर्न्स को लेके बात की जा रही थी, जो एक्चुअल वर्कर्स थे. और उन वर्कर्स में से जो लोग शायर थे उनसे कहा जाता था कि इसी प्लेटफॉर्म पे आइए और बड़े और इस्टेब्लिश शायरों के साथ बैठ के आप शायरी कीजिए. वो सब अपने हमने हाई नून में देखा है, बॉम्बे में पढ़ा है उसके बारे में, वो अब नहीं हो रहा है। आपका जो सवाल है कि ये किस हद तक, if I'm understanding you, you're saying that to what extent is it alive? Is that what you're saying?
No, actually, what I said was that what are the reasons why the impact has been dwindling? And you corroborate that by saying that there was a high noon and that does not exist anymore, which implies that the sun is setting. And how do you
The sun did set
see
many years ago, actually in the 50s.
the sun might have set, but how do you see the prospects for a revival of such a movement in the contemporary context, or is it going to be relegated to the pages of history as something which was good and romantic, but has no relevance in the present Indian context?
You know, the PWA actually never linked literature and the writing of literature to livelihood. Today, when there is nothing at par, frankly, with the PWA. There is a PWA itself, but it doesn't have that power and prestige and reach. With Ali Javed gone, I don't know who's now going to take it forward and what will happen. But even while Ali Javed Sahab was there, it was a shadow of its former self. Having said that, the few organizations that now exist for Urdu writers, the non-government players, I'm not talking about the Anjumans and the state level Sahitya academies or the apex body, the Sahitya Academy. I'm not talking about those, but the regional and the provincial and other Urdu writers associations almost always link the writing of Urdu with livelihood. कि उर्दू के promotion के लिए क्या किया जा सकता है, उर्दू की किताबें कैसी बिक सकती हैं. ये सब चीजें इश्यूज नहीं थी पीडब्ल्यूए के लिए. पीडब्ल्यूए तो कंटेंट की बात करता था, फॉर्म की बात करता था, आइडियोलॉजी की सबसे ज्यादा पहले बात करता था. मेरे ख्याल से मुझे तो नहीं कोई दिख रहा इस वक्त जो आइडियोलॉजी की बात करे या बढ़ के कहे कि नहीं ये आइडियोलॉजी है. डिक्टाट इशू करना तो बहुत दूर की बात है, जो कि पीडब्ल्यूए कर रहा था उस वक्त. तो हम डिक्टाट की तो बात ही नहीं कर रहे, लेकिन आइडियोलॉजी की भी मुझे कोई इस वक्त कोई ऐसी संस्था नहीं दिख रही जो प्योर आइडियोलॉजिकल ग्राउंड्स पे बात करे जैसा कि पीडब्ल्यूए करती थी.
थैंक यू सो मच. फजल भाई, गो अहेड प्लीज.
Assalamu alaikum. Excellent talk and equally good introduction and conclusion. So thanks a lot. Actually, part of my question has already been asked by Hassan Ghayas Sahab and answered, but let me ask anyway. It seems like that progressive movement or its thoughts seems to have died, except in academia. General public probably doesn't know about it, what the movement was. So do you think that it is needed in the present environment in India? Should it be revived?
Of course it is needed.
So hold on.
More than ever before.
Hold on, Dr. Jalil. There is a similar question. Let me read it and then you can answer both. How is the progressive movement adapting in resisting this challenge under given circumstances? So this question is from B.B. Murthy. So it's a similar question. Please go ahead.
You know, there is no movement really. There is a sporadic progressive interest. There is an interest, certainly a revival of interest in the progressive movement in academia. Certainly, I see that. Delhi University in its MPhil course and others has papers and semesters on this. Progressive writers are being taught even at the undergraduate level to mainstream English students in translation. Someone like me who did a BA and then an MA from Delhi University had a very Anglo-Saxon curriculum. That has changed hugely from my time to now. So those who are students of English literature, be it at the undergraduate or the postgraduate level, are reading Ismat Chughtai, are reading Manto and others. So that interest is certainly there. Also, with many departments of English doubling up as centers of translation studies. And there is a huge interest, a burgeoning interest in translating. So many of the faculties in these departments are very active translators themselves. And much of their work is now finding a way into curriculums. So I think that the undergraduate and postgraduate level student of even English honors is far more aware of a Manto, a Bedi, a Premchand, and Ismat Chughtai than my generation of English major students were, which is very heartening, which is not to be decried in any way, because it is not just the translation or the translated text that is prescribed reading that they're reading, but there is a whole context that they're now reading. And so I think there is a renewed interest in critical appraisals. There is a renewed interest in digging out more texts, not just the big stories, not just Khol Do by Manto or Lajwanti by Bedi and so on. But if you read one Lajwanti, then you want to read more things that Bedi would have written. If you read one Khol Do or you read one Toba Tek Singh, then you want to read what else was Manto writing. And in the process, then you discover this huge body of work of which Toba Tek Singh or this or that is located. So I see all of that as a very, very positive thing. And as I answered the question earlier, and the example I gave of that story and the other stories that I was able to find for that selection of writings I was looking on for communalism, I found many stories by writers who do not conform to the laid down definition of progressivism. And as we have seen, there is no one single definition that works for all progressives. Ismat has given her definition and she's calling Kabir a progressive. So also there can be a story by a writer, let's say for example, a name that comes to mind, Zakia Mashhadi, right? She's written a story, she's a writer from Patna. She's written a story called Bhediye Secular Hai. एक छोटा सा कस्बा है और वहां बच्चे उठा लिए जाते हैं और कहा यह जाता है कि भेड़िए हैं जो बच्चे उठा रहे हैं। तो लोगों को शुरू में शुबा ये होता है कि जरूर ये जो भेड़िया है ये हिंदू है, क्योंकि सारे मुसलमान बच्चे क्यों उठाए जा रहे हैं। फिर पता चलता है कि बहुत से इज द अदर वे अराउंड एज वेल। तो लोग फाइनली लोग कहते हैं चलो अल्लाह का शुक्र है भेड़िया सेक्युलर है। Now this is a very tongue in cheek statement on society. You see, the literary canon changes. How can we expect this lot of writers 70 years after Manto to write like Manto, to write like Bedi, to write like Krishan Chandra? You will have a Zakia Mashhadi addressing the issues that were flagged for concern by Krishan Chandra in his novel Gaddar. He talks about भीड़ से अलग जो खड़ा हो जाएगा, जो भीड़ की सोच से नहीं सोचेगा, उसको गद्दार का करार दिया जाएगा। अब वो उस पे है कि वो गद्दार होना पसंद करता है या वो अपने ह्यूमनिस्ट आइडियोलॉजी को महफूज रखना चाहता है। तो अब उसी तरह से वही बात नहीं कही जा सकती। अब आपको ज़किया मशहदी की जरूरत है जो उसी बात को लेकिन एक आज के वक्त में कहे। तो कंसर्न्स तो हैं, वही ह्यूमनिज्म, वही जेंडर जस्टिस, वही सोशल जस्टिस की बात आज भी हो रही है। कहने के तरीके बदल रहे हैं और वो लाजिम है, वो तो जरूरी है।
Okay, thank you. So next is Amna Latif, and before I invite Amna, so I will request our own Dr. Fran Prashit to be ready for a comment, and Anisur Rahman Saab. But I will invite them later. Amna, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi to everybody, and hi, ma'am. Let me say thanks, and I'm privileged to be part of this lecture. My question is, how can we ignore Akhtar Hussain Rai Puri's literary contribution, Adab aur Zindagi? Because when we analyze it, we see that Premchand was talking about the same. Then Ahmad Ali in 37, when Nehru was addressing his address was the same. So how progressive sidelined Akhtar Hussain Rai Puri? I mean, he's remarkable, his literary contribution. How historian, how critic can ignore it? Thank you.
I can't speak for others. I can only talk for myself, and I certainly have not ignored or overlooked or in any way not given the importance that his book deserves. I've talked about it at great length in my own book, and in 1935 when he writes Adab aur Zindagi, or jo usko I see it as an early part of the manifesto. मतलब अगर आप क्रोनोलॉजी देखें कि जो मैनिफेस्टो लिखा जा रहा है नवंबर 34 में, और उसके बाद जुलाई 1935 में अख्तर हुसैन रायपुरी की ये आती है अदब और जिंदगी, और जिसको मौलवी अब्दुल हक अपने रिसाले में छापते हैं, उर्दू नाम के रिसाले में छापते हैं। तो मेरे जहन में तो बिल्कुल कोई शुबा नहीं है कि इसकी अहमियत है। जहाँ तक साइडलाइनिंग का सवाल है, वो तो मैं खुद ही तस्लीम कर रही हूँ कि बहुत साइडलाइनिंग हुई है बहुत से ऐसे लोगों की। कुछ लोग जिन्होंने अपनी आवाज़ों को खुद दबाया या साइड लाइन खुद हो गए, कुछ ऐसी आवाज़ें और कुछ ऐसे लोग जिनको साइड लाइन किया गया। तो ये तो हिस्ट्री का, लिटरेरी हिस्ट्री का, तरक्की पसंद तहरीक का हिस्सा है ही, और इसमें कोई दो राय नहीं है। और जहाँ तक इस पर्टिकुलर टेक्स्ट का सवाल है, ऑफ कोर्स इसकी एक अहमियत है। I mean, I agree totally with you. It's an important text.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jalil. Madam Parshad, please, and then Dr. Sayyid Amir.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mears, and thank you, Rakhshanda, for a lovely presentation. I've put in the chat a link to the Mears book on the progressive poets, which is thanks to their generosity, I put it on my website. And so now, even if it's hard to get hold of, you can all have access to it. And I want to, my trademark here is I always talk, Rakhshanda, you haven't been privy to all of this stuff, but I've been attending several of these, and my trademark is I'm always interested in hooking up Ghalib with whatever is being said, whatever topic is current, because I work so extensively on Ghalib and Mir. And I've always been flustered, going way back to the time that the Mir brothers used to present at Madison, and their panels were always so well attended because they gave these resonant, wonderful, magnificent readings of the progressive poets, and everybody loved to hear them. And I would always think how interesting it is that everybody claims Ghalib as a progressive forerunner, but is he really? And I was always reading Ghalib myself, looking for progressive forerunner aspects of his oeuvre, of his thought in his poetry, and basically not finding them, partly because certainly not finding the opposite, not finding that he was a hidebound reactionary, but just not finding that the ghazal verse was a genre that could accommodate that kind of political thought. But I've kept on looking, and I had previously found one verse that was the nearest I could come up with, and now I have found another verse. So let me recite you first a verse from the Divan that I think represents the closest Ghalib really comes to thinking of social problems, and it isn't very close in my opinion. I believe I've actually recited it for you once before. Kaun hai jo nahi hai hajatmand? Kaun hai jo nahi hai hajatmand? Kiski hajat rava kare koi? And on my website, this is verse Ghazal 215, verse 8. And there's a lot of discussion about it. And I think it represents the level of discourse that is more typical of the Ghazal, rather than pragmatic social reforms or specific addressing of problems in a given structure of society. It's a more philosophical approach. But recently I've been working on the unpublished verses that Ghalib did not include in his Divan. And I found one more that's very interesting. It doesn't really do a progressive job, but it comes somewhat closer. So let me just recite it to you. If you're interested in finding it on the website, it's Ghazal 351X, verse 4. Nazar ba naqse gadayan Kamal be adabi hai. Nazar ba naqse gadayan Kamal be adabi hai. Ki khare khushk ko bhi davae chaman nasabi hai. So let me just translate that in case anybody didn't pick it up the first time around. A gaze at the defects or the defectiveness of beggars is the height of discourtesy. It's the height of rudeness. It's perfect rudeness. Because even a dry thorn has a claim of lineage from the garden, that you can't cut off any human being from the garden of the species. Now that too is not, because of the naqs and all that, you can say it's not very progressive in the way that one would like it to be, perhaps, but it is thought-provoking, and it does show that he's thinking about the looks at the way people look at poor people and the claims that a poor person could have on society. But again, that's a very rare example, and it's not even in the Divan. So it's just interesting. And if anybody wants to look, at Ghazal 215,8 on my website, there's a couple of links to Mir verses also that are interesting in that regard. But basically, I don't agree that Ghalib is a real forerunner of the progressive movement, not because he's hostile to it, but just because he's operating on a different level, or the ghazal genre is operating on a different level. And so I have many, many comments and thoughts about what you folks have said, but it was a lovely pleasure to hear your excellent talk, Rakhshanda, and to say hello to you after a long time.
But Fran, thank you. What do you make of a share, Francis? What do you make of a share such as "Bazicha yatfal hai dunya mere aage, hota hai shabo roz tamasha mere aage"? I find that Ghalib's own life, doesn't lend itself to progressive thought. He's very much a feudal elite, and never does he ever let go of that thought. It is there during his travels, during his interaction, during his getting angry with people, all of that. But I think if you were to look at the post-Ghadar Shairi, comparatively speaking, I think you see that element of an awareness that is possibly not there in the pre-1857 Shairi.
Okay, first of all, Ghalib almost doesn't have any post-Ghadar Shairi. His entire Divan, with one or two feeble exceptions, was composed pre-1857. So
what about Chaliya Baisi Jagah and so on?
Beg your pardon?
What about things like Chaliya Baisi Jagah?
Oh, that too, everything.
Okay, thank you so much.
Check out the dates, because almost all of it was composed before 1857. And as for the one Bazicha Yatfal, that's a kind of jeu d'esprit. It's a kind of playful little verse that's sarcastic or whatever, that the world is a toy before me. I don't see that it has any progressive implications at all.
Okay, thank you, Madam Parchat. It's always pleasure to hear you. So let's move forward. So there are 3 more people lined up, and after that I won't take any more questions. But in the end, I will invite Anisur Rahman Saab and Dr. Abdullah. So please be ready. And the next person is Victor Ghal. Oh, sorry, Sayyid Amir Saab. Then I will come back to Victor's question.
Thank you,
Amir Bhai.
Thank you, Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil. Very nice talk. I wonder, even at the high noon of this movement, progressive movement, what were the criteria or parameters applied to define somebody part of this movement, a progressive writer? Because there seem to be a range or spectrum of views which are expressed. If you think about the Faiz, Majaz, Akhtar Hussain Raipuri, they may not fit in a tight kind of scale. So maybe you can, part of it you have already, I know you have probably already described, but maybe you can elaborate. The second thing is, when you say that the movement is in decline now, does it mean that as a formal institution has gone down, but the idea is still there and people are still contributing and writing their views? Thank you.
Okay, so two things. One, Sardar Jafri writing his history of the progressive writers movement gives us a clue. He talks about sehatmand adab, healthy writing, and the opposite of progressivism during that time is regressive. If you're not a progressive, you're a regressive. If you're not writing progressive shairi or prose or whatever, you're writing regressive. And so then you ask yourself, what is regressive? So obscenity, for example, or an unusual obsession with sexual matters, with bodily matters, is for the progressives regressive. So by that measure, somebody like an Ismat, somebody like a Manto, somebody like a Meera Ji are regressive and not progressive. And during this period, Sardar Jafri and all the others are consistently holding up Krishan Chandra as what progressive a writer should be. What kind of writing should a progressive writer write? So when he talks of Sehatmand Adab, and he makes out a case as to how Manto's writing is not Sehatmand because it dwells on certain things that are regressive. Krishan Chandra, on the other hand, his writing is an example of Sehatmand Adab, because here is somebody who's writing about the concerns of a progressive writer. Of course, that he should look forward, he should look towards the future, and the future should be a bright one. You can't be looking towards a dim future or a dark future. So the writer's job then, according to the progressives, is to hold out hope, hold out optimism of a better society, of a better tomorrow, and also show the way. One way is humanism, one way is secularism, one way is the removal of communalism from your life and your ideology. So it's more by a process of elimination that you understand what is not progressivism, therefore what is progressivism. Briefly, I think that would be my answer to you. What was your second question, sir?
I was wondering whether when people talk that the movement is in decline, does it mean that the formal association has gone down, or the ideas has to be still there?
Yeah, that we have been circling around this question in the past few question answers. Also, I've been trying to say that the movement pretty much declined. There is no cutoff date. There was no one single event that we say. There are many events that led towards a disenchantment, a decline, a dwindling, all of that. So I cannot give you an answer saying that from this period onwards it became not important in our lives or in our literary landscape. No, I can't give you that. There is a process of steady decline, but also, like I tried to say, the movement itself did not die, it petered out, yes, but it's not as though it's dead. There is a functioning PWA, it has its office bearers, it still exists. I cannot say for Pakistan, but I know that in India there is a PWA, it has its meetings. Obviously, they do not have that mass support that they once enjoyed, but in certain pockets, I know I gave you the example of Ali Javed and how I've seen with my own eyes when I traveled with him to campus towns, to smaller cities, the kind of star power that a progressive poet or a progressive writer can still muster. Fran, you mentioned how the Mir brothers were such a big hit when they recited, and I can perfectly understand how they must have brought the house down, as it were, because such is the power of progressive poetry. When it is recited to a crowd, there is a rousing quality to it. Even the poetry that was earlier written. We saw this during the anti-CAA riots in Delhi 2 years ago. A lot of fairs, a lot of Habib Jalib's "Main Nahi Manta" is disengaged from its moorings, the context in which it is written for the Constitution of Pakistan. It is disengaged from there, and it is being sung, and it is being met with a rousing reception. So this is the point I'm trying to make, that certain pieces of writing rise above their time and circumstance, and they continue to speak to us. Sahir may have written that for Patrice Lumumba, but striking workers can still say, "Zulm aakhir zulm hai, badhta hai to mit jata hai." University Teachers Association sitting on a dharna against a vice chancellor in any university in India can still say, "Bol ke lab azad hain tere." So you do not then, it does not matter who and why and for what context this was written. It was written for Zia's repressive regime in Pakistan. But striking teachers in Delhi can still say this, Bol ke labaz aadhe and sing it aloud. So that is the beauty of progressive writing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jalil. We got it. Thank you so much. So there are around 15 minutes left before we finish it. And there are a few people lined up. So there's a very simple question from Victor Ghalib. How would you characterize Bollywood screen language, Hindustani or Urdu? This is a very common question always asked. You just, you can say in few words.
It's a word I don't like to use, but Hinglish, I think. I personally don't like this use, but Hinglish is what is we see in film lyrics, in cinema, which is not to say good poetry is not being written. Every now and then you will have somebody surprising you with it could be a Nilesh Mishra, it could be a Gulzar, it could be a Javed Akhtar, who will suddenly blur this distinction that we have in our mind, a distinction that has been given to us by literary critics really, between film lyrics and fine poetry. And every now and then somebody will catch you by surprise and say, hello, this is, why is this not poetry? How and why is it just film lyrics? Because it is not just for that context, but there is something in it that continues to speak to us. So Hindi cinema and its language cannot be characterized by just one measure. I think there is good and bad cinema, and there's good and bad lyrics, and there's good and bad screenplay writing. Yes, the majority of it is very pedestrian, but every now and then someone catches you by surprise.
Thank you. Thank you. So the last person who wants to ask the question is Syed Hussain Saab, and after that I will invite two people for comment, Anisur Rahman and Dr. Abdullah. Go ahead, Syed Hussain Saab. This is the last question.
ये जो बार-बार बात हो रही है कि तरक्की पसंद तहरीक dwindle हो रही है या खत्म हो रही है, और आप भी उसकी तस्दीक कर रही हैं, तो मेरा सवाल ये है कि ये तो ऐसे ही है जैसे कि कम्युनिज्म एक जमाने में it was at height of the political system, and it made an impact and it has dwindled. इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि कम्युनिज्म का इम्पैक्ट अब तक नहीं है, सोशलिज्म में काफी इम्पैक्ट है कम्युनिज्म का, इसी तरह से तरक्की पसंद अदब का काफी इम्पैक्ट है, तो लिहाजा इसको हमें तरक्की पसंद अदब को सेलिब्रेट करना चाहिए कि इट हैज लेफ्ट वेरी परमानेंट इम्पैक्ट ऑन उर्दू जो थी तरक्की पसंद से पहले की और बाद की, इट्स वेरी डिफरेंट. एंड तो बजाय ये कहने के कि जी वो तो अब मर रही है, डिमडिल हो रही है, वी सेलिब्रेट इट्स अचीवमेंट. तो आखिर ये बात क्यों नहीं कही जाती कि हमें सेलिब्रेट करना चाहिए इस तरक्की पसंद तहरीक को, उसने अपना काम किया और वो काम करके अब हट गई तो कोई हर्ज नहीं है. दिस इज व्हाट एवरी मूवमेंट इज लाइक दैट. जी
हटना नहीं चाहिए था. चलिए
नहीं, आप आपसे कह रहे हैं, शायद मैंने लफ्ज सेलिब्रेट नहीं इस्तेमाल किया है, शायद ये मेरी कमी है कि मैंने ये लफ्ज इस्तेमाल नहीं किया, लेकिन मैं रत्ती भर भी ये नहीं कह रही हूँ कि हमें इसकी सिर्फ कमियों की तरफ देखना है और इसके गेन्स की तरफ नहीं देखना है. मैंने तो अपनी बात ही शुरू यहाँ से की थी, बिल्कुल शुरू में, कि इसके गेन्स और लॉसेस, इसके सक्सेसेस और फेलियर्स हम दोनों को देख रहे हैं, और बिल्कुल इसके जो सेलिब्रेशन है तो एक ऑनगोइंग चीज हो.
चलिए, इससे पहले कि मैं कुछ और लोगों को बुलाऊं, ये बताइए, मैं जरा सा एक मामूली सा सवाल पूछ रहा हूँ. अलीगढ़ जो है, जो प्रोग्रेसिव मूवमेंट के बड़े बड़े मशहूर लोग थे, क्या हुआ वहां पर? आप क्या समझती हैं?
देखिए, अलीगढ़ में जो प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स एसोसिएशन की ब्रांच थी वो बहुत शुरू से ही बहुत एक्टिव थी. उसमें अपने वक्त में अली अहमद सुरूर और बहुत से लोग थे जो उस मूवमेंट से उस ब्रांच में एक्टिव थे, जो लिख रहे थे, रिसालों के लिए लिख रहे थे. अलीगढ़ से बहुत से रिसाले निकलते थे, तो उसमें किसी को कोई शुबा नहीं है. अलीगढ़ में एक खासी एक्टिव कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी की प्रेजेंस भी थी. और यूनिवर्सिटीज की तरह अलीगढ़ में भी स्टडी सर्कल्स हुआ करते थे। स्टडी सर्कल्स का मकसद ये था कि कोई टीचर, अब वो केमिस्ट्री का टीचर हो सकता है, फिजिक्स का हो सकता है, उर्दू का हो सकता है। अब्दुल अलीम साहब उर्दू के नहीं थे, उसके बावजूद उनकी वहाँ पे एक प्रेजेंस थी, जो पार्टी के लोग थे। और तो कुछ तो पार्टी के जरिए काम होता था, लेकिन कुछ चीजें ऐसी थी जो PWA की ब्रांच में होती थी, और वो इल्मी अदबी हल्के तक नहीं थी, बल्कि वो और कल्चरल एक्टिविटीज में जाती थी। अलीगढ़ की जहाँ तक PWA का ताल्लुक है, उसकी खासियत ये भी है, आप में से जो लोग अलीगढ़ से ताल्लुक रखते हैं, कि वो उसने उर्दू और हिंदी के बीच में बहुत से ब्रिजेस बनाए। यानी अलीगढ़ यूनिवर्सिटी शायद एक ऐसी यूनिवर्सिटी है जहाँ हिंदी डिपार्टमेंट और उर्दू डिपार्टमेंट के बीच में कोई इख्तलाफात नहीं थे, बल्कि बहुत से लोग थे जो एक ब्रिज का काम करते थे। शहरयार उनमें से एक ऐसे थे जो जनवादी लेखक संघ में भी बहुत एक्टिव थे, PWA में भी थे, प्रोग्रेसिव भी माने जाते थे, मॉडर्निस्ट भी माने जाते थे, कुंवर पाल सिंह के साथ भी उनकी नज़दीकी थी, बहुत से ऐसे लोग थे। तो अलीगढ़ का जहाँ तक ताल्लुक है, मेरे ख्याल से मूवमेंट की, अब मैं डिक्लाइन लफ्ज कहते हुए जरा हिचक रही हूँ क्योंकि लोगों को
regression of progression।
हाँ, तो बहरहाल जब तक मूवमेंट और एसोसिएशन अपने आप में इतनी स्ट्रांग नहीं थी, लेकिन अलीगढ़ एक तरह का सिटाडेल था प्रोग्रेसिविज्म के लिए बहुत तरह से, जहाँ जैसे मैंने कहा, जनवादी लेखक संघ के भी अगर मीटिंग्स हो रही हैं तो वो शहरयार को बुलाएंगे, और शहरयार जो हैं वो हिंदी डिपार्टमेंट के जलसों में जाएंगे, और उर्दू डिपार्टमेंट के जलसों में हिंदी के लोग आएंगे। तो न सिर्फ ये क्रॉस फर्टिलाइजेशन जबानों के बीच में था, बल्कि बहुत बाद तक, अब भी मैं जब मेरा पेंडेमिक से पहले अलीगढ़ जाना होता था यूनिवर्सिटी में, तो मुझे ये अंदाजा था कि एक तरह की प्रोग्रेसिव सोच है वहाँ मौजूद है और स्ट्रॉन्ग है।
शुक्रिया। अनीस और रहमान साहब।
शुक्रिया रफत साहब, इतनी बातें हो चुकी हैं, आई डोंट थिंक देयर इज मच टू टॉक अबाउट नाउ, बट Rakhshanda Sahaba, it was you have cast a very wide net, very wide net indeed, and one has learned a lot from what you have spoken this evening. You have spoken about the larger historical context and also the literary context, the socio-political context nationally and internationally. So there is large number of things that we have addressed. What Frances was saying a while ago, Frances Pritchett, I would join her by adding a few examples, because we have to be a little more careful in defining progressive writers movement as such. Otherwise, every literature is an act of confession, and by extension, every confession is an act of protest. So whatever is there in that literatures of progressive writers is, in a way, broadly speaking, some kind of protest or the other. So if you take it from that point of view, all literature is protest literature, and therefore all literature is progressive literature. But we are not talking of that literature. We are talking of a particular literary movement which took place in the early 1930s and that continued for a while, and now it has dwindled. Say, for example, some shares have come from France a while ago. I was reminded of some other shares that I will quote and see that but they are definitely not progressive. For example, अहमद शाह अब्दाली का अटैक हो चुका, नादिर शाह आ चुके हैं और दर्द लिख रहे हैं उस जमाने में कि क्या मशहूर शेर है उनका, जिंदगी है या कोई तूफान है, हम तो इस जीने के हाथों मर चले। मुसफ़ी का भी शेर आपको याद होगा, सब लोग जानते हैं, और बहुत सारे अशार ऐसे हैं जो कोट किए जा सकते हैं। वो क्या शेर है, जो मुझ पे गुजरी मत उससे कहो हुआ सो हुआ, भला कशाने मोहब्बत पे जो हुआ सो हुआ। या फिर मीर के यहाँ दोनों हाथों से थामी है दस्तार गालिब भरे। So this is not all progressive writing. This is not progressive literature at all. This is a different kind of literature. And this is a socio-political construction that every writer creates in his own or her own time. Progressive writers movement is a particular movement and a very important movement at a particular point of time. So we have to be a little careful in defining progressive writing and other kinds of writing. If you come to the modern age, very progressive you can say, but it is not progressive that way. इरफान सिद्दीकी का कितना मशहूर शेर है, गुजरात राइट्स के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में वो कहते हैं, फतेहयाब हक फतेहयाब मेरे खुदा क्यों नहीं हुआ, तूने कहा था तेरा कहा क्यों नहीं हुआ. So this is the highest kind of protest poetry. You have quoted Jalil and all. So this is one point I wanted to make and join Franz there, that we have to be a little more careful in making this distinction between progressive writers and all kinds of writing that we have other than that, where you have protest, etc. You have really covered a very huge ground, and that must be greatly appreciated because I've learned a lot from the points that we have raised. But it has also been seen in an international context. Say, for example, this was the time when in England and in America also the same kind of literature was being written. That is following the Great Wall crash and the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. And say, for example, I always remember T.S. Eliot saying at that point of time that this is not the time to write of Rose and the Rolls Royce, but the time to look beneath and discover the horror and the beauty and the ugliness. So under the carpet, we have to see and go. So, but he was not a progressive writer that way. So you have in the 30s a poet like Stephen Spender and a poet like W.H. Auden. So the entire Auden group at that point of time. So that way you have to see and how it works really. So that Rolls and the Rolls Royce, this is what the progressive writers were doing in India also, saying that don't write this kind of literature, but we have to write a different kind of literature now. And Premchand was the pioneer, and you have referred very rightly to that address of 1936, where he's trying to say कि अदब का हमारे एक नया बिहार बदलना होगा और उस चिराग में भी हुस्न है और उस झोपड़ी के अंदर भी हुस्न है, उस हुस्न को हमें, वही बात एलियट भी कह रहे थे कि we have to look beneath and discover the horror and the ugliness of the times in which we are living. So that is, but the whole net that you have cast is really great, and there I greatly appreciate what we have been saying, because इसको आप relate कर रहे हैं अगर nationally, internationally, तो you see 1930s और उसके बाद जो पूरा freedom movement है, गांधी का सीन पर हमारे आना है, और उसके बाद अगर आप बाहर जाएं तो देखें इटली में और जर्मनी में और उसके बाद रशिया में और सैनो जापानीज वॉर हो रहा है और उसके बाद Spanish civil war. Lots of things are happening, and all these things have been seen in that context, and the kind of literature that was produced there and what we were doing here in India, and मुल्क राजानंद का मिलना और इंग्लैंड में उन लोगों का मिलना और फिर वहां से हिंदुस्तान आना और इस ग्रुप को. So this is a very important moment in the literary history of India. Another very important factor we have to take note of is that it's not only in Urdu literature, but we also have to look side by side what was happening in Hindi, and more importantly in Malayalam. मलयालम का प्रोग्रेसिव राइटिंग भी जो है वो बहुत अहम है, जैसा कि हमारे मलयालम के दोस्त हमसे बताते हैं, और वही हाल हिंदी का भी है. So it is a very important movement that took, it is not a milieu, that's what I would like to very clearly state, where you have rightly said, it's a very important movement, it's not a milieu, it's not a small point, but of course it has dwindled, because new literary movements take place and postmodernism आता है, उसके बाद postmodernism का जमाना अब आ गया है, लेकिन कुछ चीजें हैं जो कदर मुश्तरक है. आपने तासीर का बहुत अच्छा जिक्र किया कि सब तासीर उसकी बाकी है, जूस निकला और जूस तो आपने पी लिया, लेकिन चीजों जो बच गई रतवयाबी से उसको आपने फेंक दिया, लेकिन तासीर बाकी रहती है. अब सवाल सिर्फ ये पैदा होता है लिटरेरी हिस्ट्री में, और जजमेंट लिटरेचर में कुछ नहीं होता. देयर इज नो जजमेंट एज सच, because judgment is not, a critic doesn't give any kind of a judgment. He just tries to read it and reread it and and every age reads it, and there is a response that you get from every age and from every kind of a reader. So that is not, the point is that what is this tasir that we actually take from the progress? It has stayed on with us for a while, but it has dwindled, of course, because it's not the same condition under which progressive writers or PWA or PWM was being was manifesting itself. So these are some of the very important questions we need to take, bifurcate the definitions, understand the definitions clearly. Also to see why it has dwindled. Of course, it cannot. No literary movement has stayed beyond a particular point of time. Look at any literary history in Urdu or English that I'm aware of. There have been times in which a particular literary movement comes and it has its heydays, and after that it dwindles, goes away. Look at the Enlightenment, literature of Enlightenment and the Romanticism. You are a student of, you know it all well. And then comes Romanticism. So that's all. हाँ, वही ज़्यादा नहीं कहना चाहता था, बस नहीं मुझे कहना था, बट बहुत अच्छी गुफ्तगू थी और काफी अच्छा आपने एक बहुत बड़ा ग्राउंड कवर किया, हिस्टोरिकली, पॉलिटिकली भी और सोशियो कल्चरल भी और लिटरेरी हिस्ट्री के हवाले से भी. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आप सब.
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. अब्दुल्ला भाई.
Unmute yourself. Abdullah bhai, unmute yourself.
I got it.
Yeah.
मैं ये कह रहा था कि भाई आमतौर पर डिनर के बाद डेजर्ट मिलता है, आप लोग चटनी पेश कर रहे हैं. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया पहले फॉर द गुड टॉक. दूसरी बात यह है कि मैं समझता हूँ कि प्रोग्रेसिव यहाँ डेफिनेशंस का चक्कर था कि प्रोग्रेसिव होना अगर ये बात है टू एक्सेप्ट ए चेंज, देन इट्स वन थिंग, लेकिन जो प्रोग्रेसिव मूवमेंट की जिसकी हम लोग बात कर रहे हैं उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हो ये रहा है कि वो इतना ज्यादा एसोसिएट हो गया था सोशलिज्म एंड कम्युनिज्म से, इस वजह से जो उसका डिक्लाइन हुआ तो प्रोग्रेसिव मूवमेंट का, और जो बाकी तमाम चीजें आपने हिस्टोरिकल इवेंट्स बताए, पार्टीशन blah blah blah, all those things happened. So as long as लोग ऐसे राइटर्स जो रहेंगे जिंदा, जो चेंज को एक्सेप्ट कर रहे हैं, जो सोशल कॉन्शियसनेस है, तो प्रोग्रेसिव मूवमेंट तो जिंदा रहेगा, फॉर्म विल चेंज, द एटीट्यूड विल बी देयर। तो मेरा ये बुनियादी तौर पर यू में आई मीन, लेकिन अगर हम मूवमेंट की बात कर रहे हैं तो दैट वाज इन सर्टेन पीरियड, लेकिन वही कि जूस तो हजम हो गया है, खुज्जड़ उज्जड़ निकल जाएगा जूस खाते रहे। थैंक यू वेरी, बहुत शुक्रिया।
थैंक यू।
लेकिन अब्दुल्ला भाई, उम्मीद ये थी कि प्रोग्रेसिव एटीट्यूड और राइटर मूवमेंट ज्यादा बढ़ेगा बनिस्बत इसके कि जो है डिक्लाइन होगा, जो कि जिसका जिक्र मुस्तकिल हो रहा है कि डिक्लाइन। आई वाज होपिंग
डिक्लाइन इन टर्म्स ऑफ ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है, जिसका रचंदन बहुत सारे वजूहात बताए हैं, बट एटीट्यूड इज देयर। आई मीन उन्होंने एक दो एग्जांपल दी, लोग लिख ही रहे हैं, कॉन्शियसनेस तो है ना फॉर द प्रॉब्लम पीपल आर।
अलीगढ़ को ही देख लीजिए आप कि क्या जबरदस्त, अब इतना ज्यादा वहां पर जो है डिक्लाइन हुआ, खास तौर से थिंकिंग में। एंड आई डोंट वांट टू नेम द नेम्स, क्योंकि वहां पर आपको मालूम है कि आजकल किस बात का जोर है या बोलबाला है।
रफत छोड़ दे अलीगढ़ को, अलीगढ़ को छोड़ दे। अलीगढ़ was never actually in core, अलीगढ़ was never a very progressive society। उसमें एक सेक्शन प्रोग्रेसिव होता था। अलीगढ़ जो है बहुत ट्रेडिशनल सोसाइटी है, और अगर आप देखें कि ये किस फार्म में और किस फार्म में इसकी ब्रांचिंग हुई है, जेएनयू के देख लें, जामिया का एक नया फॉर्म देख लें, और जगहों को देख लें, ये ब्रांच आउट हो गया है। और ये इश्यूज हैव बिकम मच मोर गॉन टू डीपर। सोशलिस्ट पार्टी के एक्टिविस्ट को देखें, मोस्टली हिंदी बेस है, बट दे कोट फैज एंड सरदार जाफरी ऑल द टाइम। कमलेश्वर की जबान बोलते, दूसरों की जबान बोलते। तो दिस मूवमेंट हैज स्प्रेडेड इनटू डिफरेंट थिंग। खैर, हम तो बचपन से, हमने पैदा ही आंख खोली तो हम उन्हीं सुर्खों के बीच में थे अलीगढ़ के। सो आई एम वेरी फेमिलियर बाय द एज ऑफ 5 or 6 ईयर कि एक नाम याद हो गया था तमाम प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स का। तो वो अभी भी जिंदा है, और इट इज वेरी गुड कि किसी और शक्ल में है। थैंक यू वेरी मच रखशंदा साहबा और मीर ब्रदर साहब लोगों का, कि जिन्होंने एक बेहतरीन इवेंट आज का था, बहुत अच्छा मुकदमा पेश किया, नो डाउट अबाउट इट। एंड ऑफ कोर्स बहुत अच्छा मुकदमा पेश किया। वी ऑल शुड रियली गिव थैंक्स।